Please take a short pre-episode survey in the description before listening to today's episode. Thank you and enjoy the show. Welcome to today's episode of Rarely Understood, where we explore important topics in healthcare and science. I'm your host, Nini Gamu, and today we're diving into a condition that affects many families but is often under-discussed: Duchenne muscular dystrophy, also known as DMD. I'm honored to be joined today by Leah, a scientist with a PhD in immunology and virology. She brings a valuable perspective as someone who has a strong scientific background and a personal connection to the condition. Leah, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here and talk about my personal journey with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. My brother had it. He was the first in our family to be diagnosed. And, back then, he was born in 1979. So back then, we didn't have any family history. My mom didn't know much about it. And so she sort of was flying by the seat of her pants as we went along with it. But again, he was the first in our family. So he unfortunately passed away at the age of 19. And then after that, my mom and I were doing some genetic testing and both found out that we were both carriers. So definitely have a personal journey to share, along with some of my scientific expertise.
Thank you for sharing, Leah. Now, let's start with the basics. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a rare but serious condition with an estimated 20,000 children diagnosed globally each year. For those who may not be familiar, can you please explain what happens in the body when someone has Duchenne muscular dystrophy?
Yeah, so what happens is there is a mutation in a gene called dystrophin, which produces a protein called dystrophin. And it's very important for sort of holding your muscle together. So basically, it connects the inside of the muscle cell with the outside of the muscle fiber. And whenever the muscle contracts and relaxes, it sort of holds the two together in a way that acts sort of as a shock absorber, people say. And so without it, when there's a mutation or a deletion where the protein's no longer expressed, whenever the muscle contracts, the cellular membrane of the muscle cell actually rips. And so you have these micro tears that go on just with normal, everyday walking, everyday muscle contractions. And over time, those get way worse and become necrotic and actually kill the muscle cell itself. So ultimately, progressively, the muscle becomes weaker, lots of muscle cells are dying, and they're replaced with fibrotic tissue and scar tissue and fat over time. And so you just eventually progressively lose muscle function completely. And it's replaced with, these fibrotic fibers that stay for life. So it can't be repaired. And so that's what happens when someone has Duchenne and there's no dystrophin produced at all. But there's also a variant called Becker's, which is a sort of a different mutation, but it leads to a protein, but it's a truncated protein, they call it. So a shorter, smaller protein. So it still functions a little bit, but not as well. And they don't have as severe of a pathology as someone with Duchenne. But again, over time, their muscles do become weaker. They will be in a wheelchair later in life and things like that. They don't have as short of a life expectancy as someone with Duchenne. But so there's sort of these variations. Duchenne is definitely the most severe. And so that's what happens in the skeletal muscle, and it affects every muscle in the body. So cardiac muscle and diaphragm is also affected. So my brother, when he passed away from respiratory failure, technically, because the diaphragm just also, becomes non-functional over time. And he was born in 1979, so this was way before any standard of care was available. He actually participated in one of the first clinical trials that was testing prednisone, like a steroid, for treating Duchenne muscular dystrophy. But he was never put on it, like as a treatment. And so nowadays, kids are put on steroids, I think, as early as almost between 3 and 5 years old. And it does help to slow down the progression of muscle loss. And so it does prolong them being out of a wheelchair. For instance, some of them can go on to not have to be in a wheelchair till they're 15 years old. My brother was in a wheelchair when he was 8. things like that. And it does seem to, extend the life expectancy in some cases. But this is still just a very progressive, fatal disease. I don't think there's a lot of people that live past the age of 40 if they're lucky enough to get there. So, but that has to do with really the cardiac and the pulmonary pathogenesis that happens kind of later on. And that's usually the cause of death in the end.
Thank you for your clear explanation. Now, I'd love to touch on your personal connection with Duchenne. You're a carrier of the condition. Can you share what that means to you?
Yes. So when I found out I was a carrier, it was actually after my brother had passed away. And we had the genetic testing done when I was a child and my brother was still alive, but I never actually received those results. And so I kind of went searching after he had passed away, and sort of, I was probably in my mid-20s, and I was starting to think about kids and things, and I knew I needed to figure out if I was a carrier or not for that purpose. So I started digging around, and we kind of had to go to a clinic in Ohio where some of my brother's blood samples had been sent during that clinical trial he was in. And then I was able to provide another blood sample for them so that they could compare mine to his, and my mom as well. And that's how we found out. So it was very difficult and sort of surprising that we found out that way. But anyway, so found out I was a carrier, and what that means for carriers, aside from, considerations you have to think about when you want to have children. There's also things that can happen to carriers. You can actually manifest symptoms of Duchenne, much less so, but you can. And it's a very interesting genetic phenomenon. And so when you're a carrier and you're a female, you have two X chromosomes. One X chromosome produces a normal dystrophin protein because it's not mutated, and the other X chromosome is mutated and will produce a non-functional dystrophin protein. So the idea is that carriers don't really have quote unquote symptoms because the X, which produces the functional dystrophin, should make up for the other X that doesn't produce functional dystrophin. However, there's this very interesting genetic phenomenon that's not really well understood. It happens in all women, all females who have two X chromosomes. The body, you have two X chromosomes that have the same genes. The body would consider it sort of redundant to be expressing proteins off of both. You don't need that. So randomly, each cell in a female's body turns off one of the X chromosomes, called X inactivation. And so with carriers of Duchenne, it's a random process. Your muscle cell randomly in your body might turn off the X chromosome that actually produces the functional dystrophin. So you'll be producing in that one muscle cell non-functional dystrophin. And it's a random stochastic process that this happens. So that's why some carriers never have any symptoms, and some carriers have symptoms right off the bat or develop them progressively over time. Your muscles become weaker and weaker. A lot of women who are carriers are, walking with walkers and canes by the time they're in their 50s and 60s. A lot of women develop cardiomyopathy because of it, and especially if they have children, because pregnancy puts a very big strain on your heart just to begin with, just in general. And so for a female carrier of Duchenne, depending on her level of X inactivation in her heart, might have a weaker heart to begin with, and then they get pregnant and then they develop cardiomyopathy, which is something you're dealing with for your whole life after that. And like other women get, muscle cramps that just won't go away for days and days. So I have that. My mom had that, and just cramps and things like that can happen, and just weakness over time. So that's what it means to be a carrier. So you have to deal with the particular potential symptoms you might develop yourself. And then if you want to have children, you also have that consideration. So since this is an X-linked disease, if you're a carrier and you get pregnant, and you are pregnant with a male fetus, then the fetus has a 50% chance of having Duchenne. If you are pregnant with a female fetus, that female has a 50% chance of being a carrier. And so there's a lot of considerations there. And there's a lot of, options out there for dealing with that aspect. But it also plays, a mental game and a stress. It's a lot to deal with, especially if you have a family history of Duchenne and you've lived the experience of it. It can be very, very, very stressful during that time of trying to have a child.
Thank you for sharing how you're personally connected to Duchenne. With your background in research, how are current advancements helping individuals with Duchenne?
Yeah, so there has been a lot going on, and we have basically patient advocacy groups to thank for the large push towards an investment in muscular dystrophy research, because it is a rare disease. So a lot of, pharmaceutical companies and things like that are not really interested because there's not a big patient population, right, for them to make their investment back. And so there needed to be a real push towards putting, federal money into research to sort of build that research base we need to then entice pharmaceutical companies to want to take that forward into a clinical trial and actually make a product out of it. So that's been a long time coming, and we've needed groups like Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, or PPMD, and MDA, Muscular Dystrophy Association, and things like that, who have really stepped up and met with Congress and convinced them that this is important, this type of research, and that it will not only, the thing is with rare disease research is that a lot of people see it very narrowly speaking, like why are you only, studying something that might only help this many people? But actually it's much more broad than that, because there's a lot of similarities between, a rare disease and a disease that affects a lot of people. So if you study this rare disease, you might actually discover something that's going to help these other people with some of these other chronic conditions. And so you can actually broaden the patient population that you can help if you think about it that way. And one of the best examples of that is the steroids. So that's standard of care for a child with Duchenne, to be started on steroids for the purpose of, dampening the inflammatory response and trying to strengthen what muscle is still there, and so forth. And they're started on at a very young age. If you've ever been on like prednisone for upper respiratory or lower respiratory infection before, the side effects are wild. And I can't imagine being on it from when I'm 3 or 5 years old through puberty, your whole life. And those side effects are just very real, sometimes very severe. And so actually my brother, when he was in the clinical trial for prednisone, they offered it to all the people in those trials after the trial was concluded, and they saw that there was a benefit. And he said no, actually, because of the side effects. And nobody's really innovated in the steroid space because they don't have to for the longest time. But because of this push in, from the patient groups and the advocacy that went on, and the investment of federal money into rare disease research and into Duchenne muscular dystrophy research, we've actually just now, I think the FDA has approved a brand new steroid recently that doesn't have any of these side effects. And it makes me really happy that now children who have Duchenne will be able to be, hopefully, if insurance will cover it, put on this brand new steroid that doesn't have all these side effects. But not only does this new steroid help people with Duchenne, it helps anyone with a chronic inflammatory condition, cystic fibrosis, autoimmune disease, all of those. And that came from research and dollars that were put into Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And that's the only reason why we came to this point. So I think it's really important to understand that we need investment and research and basic research into rare diseases. And in the end, we find out that it helps millions of people, not only the people who have that rare disease. And so that's the standard of care is steroids. And that's really just to sort of alleviate the symptoms as best you can of Duchenne. But there's also, now we've made a lot of headway in gene therapies and things like that. So that's becoming an available treatment option for people with Duchenne. So there's two ways to sort of combat the genetic disposition that people are in who have Duchenne. We can target the RNA. So a person who has a mutation in their dystrophin gene is producing a non-functional protein, and it's being read from an RNA. And so we can target that RNA with therapies called exon skipping. It's targeting specific mutations, and you can actually tailor that therapy to someone's particular mutation. So if they have a mutation in exon 50 part of the gene, and exon skipping therapy can be developed around that to essentially just skip over that problem, that mutation. And it does produce a truncated protein. So kind of what I was talking about before with Becker's, where it's functional a little bit because it's a shorter truncated protein. And it prolongs their life, though, and it does slowly progress, much more slowly than Duchenne. So with exon skipping, you can sort of give someone a Becker phenotype. Well, that's the idea. That's the hope. And actually, there's some FDA-approved exon skipping drugs out there now for certain exons. And, they are helping people, but there's issues around insurance covering it for families. And there's also just, it works, but it needs to be optimized to be more robust in how it helps to express the truncated dystrophin protein to sort of get them to that Becker's phenotype. So we can target the RNA, but we can also target the DNA, so the actual mutation in the DNA, with gene therapy and with CRISPR, which is a newer technology now, where you can actually go in and modify the gene itself. So the gene therapy that's being used in Duchenne is more of not correcting the gene that's there already, but just adding an exogenous copy of dystrophin. So the only thing we've really been able to do with that is to put in what they call a microdystrophin, which is a truncated version, again, kind of trying to induce this Becker phenotype. So it's functional. It's not as good as what a normal dystrophin protein would do, but it's something, and it can help with slowly progressing to the point where you're in a wheelchair and things like that. There's a lot of work going on in the field right now, trying to increase the packaging capacity of AAVs and other viral vectors so that you can fit more in there. But I don't know if that's going to be feasible for Duchenne in the end because it is such a large gene. I don't think we'll ever get to the point where we can fit that much into an AAV or any viral vector, but it's something. And the microdystrophin AAVs are also approved by the FDA. The problem with those right now is that when you're using these viral vectors, you induce an immune response when you give the viral vector to someone. And so you can't give it again because the second time you give it, they're going to have a massive immune response to it, and it's just going to sort of render the vector useless. So that's another issue that lots of fields are trying to figure out. And, whoever does figure it out will feed into Duchenne and actually help Duchenne. So for instance, they're trying to do this in HIV and cancer. So if they figure it out first, that's great because then we can build upon their success and use it for Duchenne. And then the other thing is the CRISPR. So that's the gene modification itself, which is very early in its field. It's being tested clinically in cancer, mostly some in HIV. There's a lot more optimization that needs to go into that. There's a lot of safety concerns that need to be worked out. But essentially, you package the the CRISPR machinery into some sort of a vector or lipo nanoparticle or something like that, give that, and then the CRISPR would get into the cell and actually get to the DNA and modify based on some instructions that you give to it so that it knows where to go and it knows how to modify and fix the problem. So that's something that's very promising if we can work out all the kinks and all the details that need to be worked out for that. But again, it's also being tried in other fields. And so Duchenne can use the successes and the work that other people are doing and apply it and build upon that. And so that's very, very promising. And hopefully, in the future we'll have, we will have gene therapies where, if someone's diagnosed with Duchenne, we can fix their genetic issue and they can live, hopefully normal lives, or even maybe we can induce a Becker phenotype and they can at least live until, into their 60s. So that would be really nice. Looking forward to seeing how the field progresses there. But really, it's only been in the last 15 years that some of this stuff has been coming to fruition, and it's been really nice to see.
That's encouraging news. It's inspiring to hear how science continues to bring hope to families affected by Duchenne. Tune into our next episode, where we'll share practical advice for those impacted by DMD and explore the importance of early detection. Be sure to check out the episode description for helpful resources, and please take the short post-episode survey too. Your feedback helps us grow. Until next time, take care.